Have you noticed how the noise in your mind seems to grow louder as you age? That constant chatter of worries, regrets, and what-ifs that follows you from morning till night. What if I told you that the serenity you've been searching for isn't something you need to add to your life, but rather what remains when you remove certain things? In a world that constantly tells you to acquire more knowledge, more experiences, more possessions, there's profound wisdom in the art of letting go. Today, we'll look into 8 invisible burdens that may be robbing you of peace in your later years. Habits and attachments that have followed you like shadows, growing heavier with each passing decade. The last one might surprise you. You've lived long enough to know that the world doesn't slow down for anyone, but inside you, something begins to shift. The noise that once felt like life, debates, ambitions, planning, worrying, now feels like weight, and not just weight, but friction. The kind that grinds against your peace, interrupts your mornings, and fills your silence with restless thoughts. This isn't a crisis. It's a sign that you're ready to trade the noise of striving for the depth of stillness. Not stillness as absence, but stillness as power. The Stoics knew this well. They taught that peace is not a reward you earn through control or achievement, but something you remember once you stop clinging to what doesn't serve you. By the end of our time together, you'll understand how to identify these 8 burdens in your own life, and, more importantly, how to release them with dignity and intention. This isn't about drastic change or painful sacrifice. It's about remembering who you are beneath the noise that has accumulated over decades. Think about this for a moment. When was the last time you experienced true silence? Not just the absence of external sound, but that rare internal quiet where your mind isn't racing from thought to thought, worry to worry, plan to plan. For many of us in our later years, that kind of silence has become increasingly rare, almost foreign. The paradox is that as we gain wisdom through living, we often accumulate mental and emotional habits that obscure that very wisdom. Habits that may have served us well in the demanding middle decades of our lives, but now stand between us and the serenity that should be the natural reward of a life well lived. The ancient Stoics understood this tension. Marcus Aurelius, who recorded his personal reflections while leading the vast Roman Empire, reminded himself daily, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." Even as emperor of the known world, he recognized that true peace came not from gaining more, but from releasing what wasn't essential. Before we continue, if you're committed to finding the best version of yourself, comment the number 1 below. Now back to where we were. Seneca, another great Stoic philosopher, wrote letters to his friend Lucilius about finding tranquility in a chaotic world. "It is not that we have a short time to live," he observed, "but that we waste much of it." His insight points to something many of us feel intuitively as we age, that time becomes more precious, and how we spend our mental and emotional energy matters more than ever. These ancient wisdom traditions align perfectly with what modern psychology tells us about well-being in our later years. The capacity to let go of regrets, of rigid patterns, of others' expectations, correlates strongly with life satisfaction after 60. Yet letting go is often misunderstood as surrender or loss, when in reality it's a form of reclamation, taking back the energy we've been giving to things that don't deserve it. In the coming minutes, we'll examine 8 specific burdens that commonly accumulate by our 6th, 7th, or 8th decades. These aren't physical objects to discard, but mental and emotional patterns that have become so familiar you might not even recognize them as optional. They've become like background noise, the hum of a refrigerator you only notice when it suddenly stops. And when these burdens are released, many describe it as a homecoming to themselves, a recognition of a peace that was always there, just beneath the surface of busyness and noise. A clearing of the path back to your own center. To help you see this more clearly, I want to share a story with you. Margaret, at 72, had always been the family pillar, the one who remembered every birthday, mediated every conflict, and maintained the appearance of having it all together. Her husband, Richard, had passed away 3 years ago, leaving her alone in the 2-story home where they'd raised 3 children. Her days were filled with volunteer work, grandchildren's activities, and what she called keeping busy to stay useful. But lately, exhaustion had been settling into her bones like an unwelcome guest. She couldn't quite name what was wrong. Her health was relatively good, her finances were stable, her family was loving if sometimes overbearing, yet something felt off balance, as if she were carrying an invisible weight that grew heavier by the day. One Tuesday afternoon, Margaret found herself sitting on a park bench beside an older gentleman named Thomas. At 85, Thomas had a tranquility about him that seemed to extend beyond his person, like a gentle field of calm. He was sketching the lake, his hands steady despite their age. "You seem troubled today," Thomas said, not looking up from his drawing. Margaret was startled. She prided herself on keeping her struggles private. "Do I? I'm fine, really. Just a bit tired." Thomas smiled. At our age, being fine and being at peace are 2 very different states. One is a performance, the other is a presence. "I'm not performing," Margaret replied, a defensive edge in her voice. Thomas put down his pencil and turned to face her. "May I ask you something? When was the last time you sat in silence without feeling like you needed to fill it with activity or worry?" Margaret opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. The question landed in a tender spot. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "There's always something that needs doing or someone who needs me." "And this brings you peace?" Thomas asked. "Gently. It brings me purpose," she countered. "Purpose and peace aren't mutually exclusive," Thomas said. "But one can certainly crowd out the other when it becomes a way of avoiding stillness." Margaret felt a flicker of recognition. "My daughter tells me I need to slow down and enjoy life now, but she doesn't understand. When you've been in motion for decades, stillness feels like failure." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I felt the same way after I retired. My worth had been so tied to productivity that rest felt like surrender. But I've learned something I wish someone had told me earlier." "What's that?" Margaret asked, finding herself genuinely curious. "That there are things we need to silently release before we can find true serenity. Not through more effort or striving, but through letting go." "That sounds like something from those meditation apps my granddaughter keeps recommending," Margaret said with a small laugh. "Much older than that," Thomas smiled. "The ancient Stoics understood this centuries ago." Margaret looked doubtful. "That's easier said than done." "Indeed," Thomas agreed. "Which is why it helps to be specific about what needs releasing." The afternoon light had begun to soften, casting long shadows across the park. A family of ducks glided across the lake, their movement effortless and present. "I've identified 8 specific burdens that most of us carry into our later years," Thomas continued. 8 things that, when released, create space for the serenity that is our birthright at this stage of life. Margaret found herself leaning forward slightly. 8 things, Thomas nodded. 8 patterns of thinking and feeling that create unnecessary friction in our lives. Patterns that may have served us when we were younger, raising families or building careers, but now only drain our precious energy. "And you've managed to let them go?" Margaret asked, a hint of skepticism in her voice. Thomas smiled. "It's an ongoing practice, not a one-time achievement. But yes, I've found tremendous relief in releasing these burdens. The difference between my life at 70 and my life now at 85 isn't primarily physical. It's the quality of peace I experience day to day." "I could use some of that," Margaret admitted. "Most days I feel like I'm running just to stay in place. Mentally, I mean." "That's exactly the sensation these burdens create," Thomas said. a constant mental and emotional exertion that yields diminishing returns. Margaret glanced at her watch, a habit more than a necessity. I should probably be getting home. Before you go, Thomas said, would you like to know what these 8 things are? The ones I've found most crucial to release? Margaret hesitated, only briefly before nodding. Yes, I would. Thomas carefully tore the sketch from his pad and handed it to her, a reminder of this conversation. And perhaps we could meet here again next week? Same time? Margaret looked down at the drawing, simple yet profound. The lake, the trees, the bench. But what struck her was the sense of stillness Thomas had somehow captured on paper. Not emptiness, but fullness. Not absence, but presence. I'd like that, she said, meaning it. As Margaret walked home, she felt something shift inside her, not a dramatic transformation, but a small opening, a willingness to consider what she might release to make room for greater peace. What were these 8 burdens Thomas had mentioned? She found herself genuinely curious, even eager to learn more. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Margaret didn't rush home to her next task, her next obligation. She walked slowly, noticing the changing light, the feel of the air, the sound of birds preparing for evening. And in that moment, she caught a glimpse of what serenity might feel like, not as a distant goal, but as a present possibility. Next week, she would return to the bench by the lake, and perhaps, with Thomas's guidance, she would begin to understand exactly what stood between her and the peace she'd been seeking for so long. 8 things, he'd said, 8 burdens to release, 8 pathways back to herself. She was ready to listen. The following week arrived with unusual clarity. Margaret found herself walking to the park earlier than necessary, anticipating her conversation with Thomas. She spotted him on the same bench, sketchbook in hand, observing the world with that same peaceful presence she had found so compelling. You came back, Thomas said with a warm smile as she approached. I've been thinking about what you said, Margaret replied, settling beside him. About the burdens we carry without realizing it. Thomas nodded. Most of what weighs us down in our later years isn't physical but invisible. Thought patterns and emotional habits that no longer serve us, if they ever did. You mentioned there were 8 specific things to release, Margaret said. I'm curious about what they are. I'll share them with you, Thomas said, closing his sketchbook. But remember, recognizing these patterns is just the beginning. The real work is in the consistent practice of letting them go. Margaret nodded, feeling a mixture of anticipation and slight apprehension. The first burden to release, Thomas began, is the need to explain yourself. Think about how much energy you spend justifying your actions, your choices, your silence, or your presence to others. Margaret sighed with immediate recognition. Too much, especially with my children. They mean well, but I feel like I'm constantly defending my decisions. This burden begins innocently enough, Thomas explained. As social beings, we naturally want to be understood, but somewhere along the way, explaining becomes justifying, and justifying becomes a habit that drains our energy and undermines our authority over our own lives. Like when my daughter questioned why I still drive at night, Margaret said. I found myself listing all the precautions I take, my perfect driving record, how rarely I go out after dark, instead of simply acknowledging her concern and moving on. Exactly, Thomas nodded. The compulsion to explain ourselves often stems from a deeper fear that our choices aren't valid unless others approve of them. But at our age, we've earned the right to make decisions without submitting them for review. So how do you stop? Margaret asked. It feels almost reflexive at this point. It starts with recognizing that you are not obligated to explain every feeling to people who may never understand. Sometimes the strongest answer is none, not out of pride, but from clarity, Thomas said. Practice responding with simple statements. This works for me, or I've given it thought and this is my decision. No defense, no justification. That sounds terrifying, Margaret admitted with a small laugh, and also liberating. Both are. True, Thomas smiled. The first few times it will feel uncomfortable, but with practice, you'll notice how much energy you reclaim, energy that can be directed toward what truly matters to you. I had a situation last week, Margaret shared after a moment of reflection. My son suggested I should sell the house because it's too much for me to maintain. Instead of my usual 20-minute justification about why I want to stay, I simply said, "I understand your concern, but I'm happy here." He looked surprised, but the conversation moved on. "And how did that feel?" Thomas asked. "Strange at first," Margaret replied, "but afterward I felt stronger somehow, more centered in myself." "That's the paradox of releasing this burden," Thomas nodded. What feels like vulnerability initially becomes a source of strength. When you no longer feel compelled to explain who you are, you begin to remember it for yourself. They sat quietly for a moment, watching a pair of cardinals flit between trees. "The second burden to release," Thomas continued, "is the habit of overthinking. This one is particularly challenging because our culture tends to praise analysis and deliberation. But there's a tipping point where reflection becomes rumination, where thinking about a problem creates more suffering than the problem itself." Margaret shifted uncomfortably on the bench. "You mean like lying awake at 3 in the morning going over the same thoughts again and again?" "Precisely," Thomas said. "Reflection is wise, but spiraling in your thoughts, going over the same scenarios, the same doubts, the same what-ifs, this is not wisdom. It's paralysis." "I do this constantly," Margaret admitted. "I can spend days deliberating over decisions that probably don't warrant that much mental energy." "The Stoics had a practical approach to this tendency," Thomas explained. "Epictetus taught his students to distinguish between what they could control and what they couldn't. This simple discernment cuts through much of our overthinking." "How so?" Margaret asked. "When you catch yourself in an overthinking spiral, ask, is this something I can influence, or am I trying to control the uncontrollable? If it's within your influence, decide on one small action you can take, then take it. If it's beyond your control, practice the art of acceptance." "That sounds simpler than it is," Margaret said with a wry smile. "Most wisdom is," Thomas agreed. "But consider this. Action calms the mind. Even small, imperfect movement forward clears more fear than the most elegant analysis. The Stoics did not wait for certainty. They acted with intention and let the results unfold as they must." Margaret thought about this. "Last month I couldn't decide whether to join a painting class I was interested in. I spent weeks weighing the pros and cons, the cost, the time commitment, whether I'd be any good, what the other students would think of my work. In the end, I decided not to go, mostly because I'd exhausted myself with thinking about it. And if you had simply signed up the day you first heard about it," Thomas asked, "I might have discovered I love painting, or that I'm terrible at it but enjoy the process anyway, or that it wasn't for me, but at least I'd know from experience rather than speculation," Margaret realized. "Instead, I have neither the experience nor the energy I spent contemplating it." "Exactly," Thomas said. "Our minds convince us that extensive analysis leads to better outcomes, but often it simply delays life and drains our limited energy. The antidote is decisive action coupled with a willingness to adjust course as needed. So when I notice myself overthinking," Margaret began, "recognize it as a habit, not a virtue," Thomas finished for her. "Then either act on what you can influence or practice accepting what you cannot. Either way, you step out of the thinking loop and back into life." Margaret nodded slowly, absorbing this. "That would free up a lot of mental space. More than most people realize," Thomas said. "Now, are you ready for the third burden to release?" Margaret nodded, feeling increasingly engaged with each insight. "The third burden is the reflex to compare," Thomas continued. You've seen lives bloom and fall around you over many decades. But when you measure your own peace against someone else's highlight reel, you lose sight of what's truly yours. Like comparing my grieving process to other widows, Margaret said quietly. Exactly, Thomas nodded. Or comparing your energy level to peers who seem more active, your financial situation to those who appear more secure, your family relationships to those that seem more harmonious. I do this all the time without even realizing it, Margaret admitted. Just yesterday, I found myself feeling inadequate because my neighbor travels internationally twice a year, while I haven't left the country in decades. And did that comparison bring you clarity about what you truly want? Thomas asked. Margaret considered this. No, it just made me feel like I'm doing retirement wrong somehow. That's the insidious nature of comparison, Thomas explained. It distracts us from our authentic path by suggesting there's a universal standard for a well-lived life. But meaning is deeply personal. What brings your neighbor alive might leave you cold. So how do we stop comparing? Margaret asked. First, by recognizing when you're doing it, Thomas replied. Comparison often disguises itself as admiration or inspiration, but leaves you feeling diminished rather than uplifted. That's exactly it, Margaret nodded. Then practice redirecting your attention to what I call your inner alignment. How closely your daily choices reflect what matters most to you, regardless of others' paths. True peace doesn't need a mirror. It needs roots. Inner alignment, Margaret repeated thoughtfully. I like that concept. The Stoics understood this well, Thomas continued. Marcus Aurelius warned against concerning ourselves with others' opinions or actions, advising instead to look directly at the thing itself. In our context, that means looking directly at your own authentic needs and values, not at how your life compares to someone else's. If this topic interests you, comment 1 below. This helps me better understand what you like. Continuing. I can see how freeing that would be, Margaret said, but it's so ingrained to measure myself against others. Indeed, Thomas agreed, which is why it helps to develop the habit of asking better questions. When you notice comparison arising, ask yourself, is this relevant to my path? Does this reflect what matters most to me? Often, the answer is no. Margaret sat with this for a moment. I've always admired my friend Eleanor's ability to make new friends easily. I've felt inadequate beside her social confidence. But when I think about it, deep connections with a few people have always meant more to me than maintaining a wide social circle. There you have it, Thomas smiled. You were measuring yourself against a value that isn't central to your authentic self. Wealth, recognition, family size, activity level, social influence, these will always vary. But what matters is how aligned you are with yourself. Margaret nodded, feeling a growing sense of clarity. Ready for the fourth burden? Thomas asked. Absolutely, Margaret replied. The fourth burden to release is the obsession with being busy, Thomas said. This one is particularly tricky because our generation was raised to equate activity with worth. Many of us built our identities around productivity and usefulness. That describes me perfectly, Margaret admitted. I feel anxious when I'm not being productive. Consider this distinction, Thomas said. Activity is not the same as meaning. The world may have trained you to equate usefulness with constant doing, but real worth is not found in movement, it is found in presence. What exactly do you mean by presence? Margaret asked. Being fully engaged with whatever is before you without dividing your attention or rushing ahead to the next task, Thomas explained. Whether that's having a conversation, enjoying a meal, reading a book, or simply sitting in silence, presence is the quality of being completely where you are. That's rare for me, Margaret admitted. I'm usually mentally reviewing my to-do list or planning something, even during supposedly relaxing activities. Most people live this way, Thomas nodded, but it comes at a cost. As Seneca said, it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. We waste it not just through procrastination or frivolity, but by never being fully present for our own lives. So the antidote to busyness is presence, not inactivity, Margaret clarified. Precisely, Thomas said. The mind rests when it is allowed to stop performing. Let your value be felt in your stillness, not just your output. But what about contributing, Margaret asked. Being of service has always been important to me. Service that comes from a centered, present place is far more powerful than service, motivated by a need to feel useful, Thomas explained. The question isn't whether to engage with life, but how you engage, from restlessness or from peace. Margaret considered this. I volunteer at the hospital 3 mornings a week. Some days it feels meaningful and energizing. Other days it feels like I'm just checking a box to feel productive. The difference is likely in your presence, Thomas suggested. When you're there to truly be with patients, to listen fully, to offer your undivided attention, that's service from presence. When you're there to fulfill an obligation or to avoid facing silence, that's service from busyness. I never thought of it that way, Margaret said. This doesn't mean you should abandon your commitments, Thomas clarified, but it might mean examining your relationship to them. Are they expressions of your values, or are they ways to avoid stillness? Margaret nodded slowly. I can see I'll need to reflect on this. The practice is simple, though not easy, Thomas said. Begin by creating small pockets of unscheduled time in your days, not time to catch up on tasks, but time to simply be. Notice the resistance that arises, the urge to fill that space. Then practice allowing that discomfort without acting on it. Like meditation, Margaret asked. Meditation is one approach, Thomas nodded. But this practice can happen while walking, sitting in your garden, or even washing dishes. Anytime you're fully present with what is, without rushing to what's next. I can try that, Margaret said, though her tone suggested uncertainty. Start small, Thomas encouraged. Perhaps 10 minutes a day of deliberately unscheduled time. Notice how it feels, both the discomfort and the potential relief. 10 minutes seems manageable, Margaret agreed. In those minutes, you might begin to discover something remarkable, Thomas said. That peace doesn't come from achieving or acquiring more, but from removing the noise that drowns it out. As we release these burdens, the need to explain ourselves, the habit of overthinking, the reflex to compare, and the obsession with busyness, we create space for serenity to emerge naturally. Margaret looked out over the lake, where the afternoon light played on gentle ripples. 4 down, 4 to go, she said with a small smile. I'm beginning to see why you find this bench so appealing. There's a clarity that comes with being here, away from all the doing. The bench is just a location, Thomas said. The clarity comes from giving yourself permission to pause, to step out of the stream of activity and into the spaciousness of presence. That permission is something you can grant yourself anywhere, anytime. I'd like to hear about the other 4 burdens, Margaret said. But maybe next week? I want to sit with these first ones, see if I can begin to practice releasing them. A wise approach, Thomas nodded, opening his sketchbook again. Integration is more important than information. Take the week to notice these patterns in your daily life, where you feel compelled to explain yourself, when you get caught in overthinking, how comparison shows up, and the moments when busyness becomes an end in itself. I will, Margaret promised. Same time next week. I'll be here, Thomas smiled. And Margaret, remember that this isn't about perfection, it's about awareness. Simply noticing these patterns is the beginning of freedom from them. As Margaret walked home, she felt lighter somehow, as if the simple recognition of these invisible burdens had already begun to loosen their hold. She wondered what changes might emerge if she truly began to release them, one by one. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she walked without hurry, noticing the world around her with fresh attention. And in that quiet attentiveness, she caught another glimpse of the serenity Thomas embodied, not as something to achieve, but as a natural state that emerges when we stop drowning it out with noise. The following Tuesday arrived with a gentle rain that cleared just before Margaret's walk to the park. She found Thomas already at their bench, his sketchbook protected under a weathered jacket. He smiled as she approached, a warm recognition lighting his eyes. "How was your week of practice?" he asked as she settled beside him. "Illuminating," Margaret replied, "and humbling. I had no idea how often I explained myself until I started paying attention. Just yesterday, I caught myself giving my neighbor a 5-minute justification for why I decided to cancel my newspaper subscription." Thomas chuckled. "Awareness is the first step. Did you notice the other patterns as well?" "All of them," Margaret nodded. "Especially the busyness. I realized I've been filling nearly every moment with activity for so long that stillness feels almost threatening. But I tried those 10-minute periods of unscheduled time you suggested. By the third day, something shifted. I actually began to look forward to that space." "That's significant progress," Thomas said. "Many people never get past the initial discomfort of stillness." "I'm ready to hear about the other 4 burdens," Margaret said. "I've been curious all week." Thomas nodded, setting aside his sketchbook. "The 5th burden to release is the hunger for approval. This one runs deep for most of us, often operating below conscious awareness." "You mean caring what others think of us?" Margaret asked. "Precisely," Thomas confirmed. "You are not a reputation. You are not what others decide to think of you. If your peace depends on applause or recognition, you will always feel one comment away from collapse." Margaret shifted uncomfortably on the bench. "I'd like to think I've outgrown that concern at my age, but that wouldn't be honest. I still find myself wanting approval, especially from my children." "The desire for connection and understanding is natural," Thomas clarified. "What becomes burdensome is when our sense of worth becomes contingent on others' opinions, when we adjust our authentic expression to secure approval. Like when I don't mention certain interests or opinions because I know my daughter would disapprove," Margaret admitted. "Or when we diminish our own joy in something because others might find it frivolous or inappropriate for our age," Thomas added. "The habit of editing ourselves to fit others' expectations is exhausting and ultimately futile." "Why futile?" Margaret asked. "Because others' perceptions are beyond our control," Thomas explained. "The Stoic path is one of inner alignment, not performance for an audience. You must become your own witness. Only then will external voices lose their grip on your worth." "That sounds liberating," Margaret said, "but also very difficult after a lifetime of considering others' reactions." "It is both," Thomas agreed. "The practice begins with noticing when you're making choices based on anticipated approval or disapproval rather than your own inner compass. Then, experiment with small acts of authenticity, saying what you truly think, pursuing interests that call to you, setting boundaries that honor your needs, even when these might not receive universal approval." "I've been wanting to take a ceramics class," Margaret shared, "but I haven't mentioned it to my children because they'll think it's a waste of money at my age. 'Mom, you don't need more stuff,' they'll say." "And what would following your genuine interest feel like regardless of their opinion?" Thomas asked. Margaret's face softened. "Exciting, like reconnecting with a creative part of myself I've neglected." "That excitement is worth listening to," Thomas said gently. "It's your authenticity, signaling a path toward greater alignment and joy." "I think I'll register for that class this week," Margaret decided, a new resolve in her voice. "Excellent," Thomas smiled. "Remember, the goal isn't to disregard others completely, it's to ensure their opinions aren't the primary force guiding your choices. The question becomes, what feels true to me, rather than what will they think of this?" They sat quietly for a moment, watching a heron stalk gracefully through the shallows of the lake. "The 6th burden to release," Thomas continued, "is the illusion of control. This one becomes both more obvious and more difficult as we age. How so? Margaret asked. More obvious because life has shown us repeatedly how many things lie beyond our influence, health challenges, losses, others' choices. More difficult because facing our lack of control can be frightening, especially in later years when vulnerability increases. Margaret nodded slowly. I've certainly experienced that. After Richard died, I developed all these elaborate routines and precautions, as if somehow the right combination of vigilance would protect me from further loss. That's exactly the pattern, Thomas confirmed. How many sleepless nights have you given to trying to control things that were never yours? The actions of others, the outcomes of your plans, the shape of the future. Control is comforting until it becomes a cage. I never thought of it that way, Margaret said. As a cage. Consider what the effort to maintain control costs you, Thomas suggested. The constant vigilance, the anxiety when things don't go as planned, the inability to be fully present because part of your attention is always managing potential variables. It's exhausting, Margaret admitted. The Stoics divided the world into two halves. What depends on us and what does not, Thomas explained. Your power ends at your own thoughts and choices. Beyond that is the domain of nature, chance, and time. Let it be. Let it be, Margaret repeated. That sounds simple, but it feels terrifying. It's both, Thomas acknowledged. The practice isn't about abandoning responsibility for what genuinely is yours to influence. It's about discerning where your circle of control truly ends and developing the wisdom to release what lies beyond it. How do you practice that? Margaret asked. Begin by asking, in any situation causing you distress, what aspects of this can I directly influence through my choices? Focus your energy there. For everything else, develop the habit of saying to yourself, this is not mine to control. Not with resignation, but with clarity. Margaret considered this. When my son was going through his divorce, I spent months trying to manage his emotions, offer the right advice, even attempting to mediate between him and his ex-wife. None of it helped, and I was constantly stressed. And what was actually within your control in that situation? Thomas asked. How I showed up for him, Margaret realized. Being present, listening without judgment, offering support without trying to fix his life. The outcome of his marriage, his feelings, his ex-wife's choices, none of that was mine to determine. Exactly, Thomas nodded. When we release the illusion of control, we don't become passive. We become discerning about where to direct our limited energy. That would save so much anxiety, Margaret said thoughtfully. Indeed, Thomas agreed. And it opens the door to something many find surprising, genuine peace with uncertainty. Not because the unknown isn't sometimes frightening, but because we no longer exhaust ourselves trying to make it known. Margaret nodded, absorbing this wisdom. Ready for the seventh burden? Thomas asked. Yes, Margaret replied, feeling increasingly lighter with each insight. The seventh burden to release is emotional dependence, Thomas continued. This one touches on our relationships with partners, children, friends, and family. What exactly do you mean by emotional dependence? Margaret asked. It's human to want connection, Thomas explained, but to make someone else responsible for your peace, your self-esteem, your sense of being enough, this is not love, it's burden. And it leaves you unsteady. Margaret thought immediately of her relationship with her children, like how anxious I feel when my daughter doesn't call for several days, or when my son seems distant at family gatherings. Precisely, Thomas nodded. Those reactions suggest your emotional stability depends partly on their behavior, something you can't control. But isn't it normal to care about connection with your children? Margaret asked, a defensiveness creeping into her voice. Absolutely, Thomas assured her. The distinction is between caring about connection and requiring certain behaviors or responses from others to feel okay within yourself. The former enriches life, the latter creates suffering. I'm not sure I see how to care deeply without some emotional dependence, Margaret admitted. Please hit the subscribe button if you appreciate advice like this. It helps us create more content you can use. Back to where we were. Consider two types of love, Thomas suggested. One says, I need you to be a certain way so I can feel secure. The other says, I value you deeply and I remain emotionally whole, whether you respond as I hope or not. The second kind allows for true intimacy because it comes from fullness rather than need. That sounds like a lifetime of practice, Margaret said with a small laugh. Indeed it is, Thomas agreed. You must learn to comfort yourself, to accompany yourself, to be whole without needing to be completed by anyone. That's not isolation, it's liberation. Where does one even begin with that? Margaret asked. By developing what I think of as emotional self-sufficiency, Thomas replied. This means creating internal resources that don't depend on others, responses or validation, such as practices that connect you to your own center, meditation, time in nature, creative expression, meaningful solitude. Relationships with yourself characterized by the same kindness and patience you'd offer a dear friend, and perhaps most importantly, the habit of turning toward difficult emotions rather than seeking immediate relief through others' reassurance. Margaret nodded slowly. I notice I often call my daughter when I'm feeling anxious or lonely, hoping her response will make those feelings go away. And does it work? Thomas asked gently. Temporarily, Margaret admitted, but the feelings usually return, sometimes stronger. That's because emotional dependence creates a pattern where we outsource our inner work to others, Thomas explained. True emotional resilience comes from learning to be present with our own experience, comfortable in our own company, able to navigate our inner landscape without requiring rescue. This doesn't mean we don't need relationships, Thomas clarified, seeing concern in Margaret's expression. Quite the opposite. When we release emotional dependence, our connections often deepen because they're no longer burdened with the responsibility. And for our well-being, I can see how that would be true, Margaret said. There's a difference between sharing my life with my children and needing them to make me feel worthwhile or secure. Exactly, Thomas smiled. The practice is to notice when you're seeking external solutions to internal states. In those moments, try turning toward your experience with kindness and curiosity instead. Ask what you truly need and consider how you might provide that for yourself. Margaret sat with this insight, feeling both challenged and inspired by its implications for her relationships. And now we come to the eighth and final burden, Thomas said after a moment of companionable silence. The attachment to the past. Margaret sighed. This one hits close to home. For all of us, Thomas nodded. You cannot step into peace while carrying the weight of yesterday. Regrets, mistakes, betrayals, old versions of yourself, they have no power unless you keep them alive. But some memories feel impossible to release, Margaret said quietly, thinking of her husband's difficult final months, of opportunities missed with her children when they were young, of paths not taken. The attachment isn't in the remembering, Thomas clarified. It's in the reliving, the ruminating, the using of past events to construct a narrative about who you are and what's possible for you now. Like how I still think of myself as not creative because of a teacher's comment when I was 12, Margaret offered. Exactly, Thomas said. Or how a past financial mistake might still dictate your sense of competence today. Or how an old betrayal can make trust seem permanently dangerous. So how do we release the past without denying it happened? Margaret asked. By recognizing that memory is not the same as identity, Thomas explained. The Stoics taught that we own nothing except the present moment. What has happened is no longer in your hands, but what happens next, that is still yours to shape. The present is not a punishment, it is a permission, Thomas continued. Permission to begin again, to see with fresh eyes, to choose differently. That's a powerful perspective, Margaret said thoughtfully. The practice involves a simple but profound shift, Thomas explained. When you notice yourself defining your present possibilities by past experiences, gently remind yourself, that was then. This is now. I am not bound by what has been. I've been avoiding social events since Richard died, Margaret admitted. And not just because of grief, but because we always attended together. I've been thinking of myself as half of a couple for so long that solo appearances feel wrong somehow. And if you were to separate your identity from that past reality, Thomas asked, if you were to give yourself permission to discover who Margaret is now? It's scary, she admitted, but also intriguing. There might be aspects of myself I've never explored because they didn't fit into my married life. Precisely, Thomas nodded. The past has much to teach us, but it makes a poor master. Your history is a chapter, not your whole story. Margaret gazed out at the lake, watching light play across its surface. These 8 burdens, the need to explain yourself, overthinking, comparing, busyness, hunger for approval, illusion of control, emotional dependence, and attachment to the past, they're all connected, aren't they? They are indeed, Thomas confirmed. Each one represents a different way we leave our center and lose touch with the peace that is our natural state. Together, they form a kind of framework that keeps us from the serenity that is our birthright in these later years. And when we release them, Margaret asked. Space opens, Thomas said simply. Space in which a different quality of life becomes possible. Not a life without challenges, but one where challenges no longer define your inner landscape. I can feel that possibility, Margaret said. Just sitting here, talking about these patterns, I already sense a kind of lightness that wasn't there before. That lightness is your natural state, Thomas smiled. What you're releasing isn't who you are. It's what has accumulated around your true self over decades of living in a noisy, demanding world. Margaret nodded, a new clarity in her eyes. Thank you, Thomas, for sharing this wisdom, for helping me see what I've been carrying. The seeing is your own, Thomas replied, and the releasing will be too. One small choice at a time, one moment of awareness, one breath of letting go. As Margaret walked home through the late afternoon, light, she felt something shift inside her. Not a dramatic transformation, but a spaciousness that hadn't been there before. The 8 burdens Thomas had described were still present in her life, but now they were visible to her, no longer operating undetected beneath her awareness. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Margaret felt genuinely hopeful about her future. Not because circumstances had changed, but because she was beginning to recognize her own capacity for inner freedom. The path ahead would require practice, patience, and compassion for herself when old patterns reasserted themselves. But now she could see it, a way of being that wasn't defined by striving or proving or managing or fixing. The possibility of peace was already within her, waiting to be remembered. Weeks passed, each Tuesday bringing Margaret and Thomas together on their bench by the lake. Summer eased into early autumn, the air growing crisp, the leaves beginning their transition from green to gold. And just as the seasons shifted, so too did something within Margaret. On this particular afternoon, she arrived at the bench with a lightness in her step that hadn't been there during their first encounter. Thomas looked up from his sketch with a warm smile of recognition, not just of her face, but of the quiet transformation evident in her presence. "You seem different today," he observed as she sat beside him. Margaret nodded, a gentle certainty in her expression. "I am, not dramatically, not completely, but there's a space inside me now that wasn't there before. A quietness that stays with me, even on difficult days. Tell me about your practice," Thomas invited, closing his sketchbook to give her his full attention. "I've been working with all 8 burdens," Margaret began. "Some are easier to release than others. The need to explain myself was the first, to loosen its grip. Just last week, my son questioned my decision to stay in my house through the winter instead of going to Florida like his sister suggested. 6 months ago, I would have launched into a defensive explanation. Instead, I simply said, 'I've given it thought, and this is what works for me.'" "And his response?" Thomas asked. "He looked surprised for a moment, then nodded and changed the subject." Margaret said with a small laugh, "All that energy I used to spend justifying my choices, what a waste." "What about the other patterns?" Thomas asked. "Overthinking is still challenging," Margaret admitted, "but I'm getting better at catching myself in those spirals. When I notice it happening, I ask myself, is this useful reflection or just mental spinning? If it's the latter, I try to take even a small action instead of continuing to analyze." "That's significant progress," Thomas nodded. "Any action, however small, can break the paralysis of overthinking." "The comparison habit is fading too," Margaret continued. "I've started focusing on what you called inner alignment, whether my choices reflect what truly matters to me rather than how my life measures up to others. It's bringing me a peace I haven't felt in years." "And what about the hunger for approval?" Thomas inquired. "That one goes deep," Margaret acknowledged. "But I took your advice about small acts of authenticity. I registered for that ceramics class we talked about, despite knowing my children might disapprove of the expense. The joy it's bringing me confirms I made the right choice for myself." "The right choice for yourself," Thomas repeated with a smile. That phrase itself represents significant growth. "As for busyness," Margaret continued, "those 10-minute periods of unscheduled time have gradually expanded. I now have entire mornings where I allow myself to simply be, reading, looking out the window, walking without a destination. The anxiety that used to arise in stillness has softened into something closer to contentment." Thomas nodded, genuine pleasure in his eyes as he witnessed her evolution. "The illusion of control has been perhaps the most revealing to examine," Margaret said thoughtfully. "I'm seeing how much energy I've spent trying to manage outcomes that were never mine to determine. My children's choices, my health concerns, even the weather on days I've planned activities." "And as you've released that illusion," Thomas prompted, "there's a surrender that brings its own kind of peace," Margaret replied. "Not giving up, but a wise discernment about where my energy belongs. I'm learning to say, this is not mine to control without feeling that I've failed somehow. That wisdom alone transforms daily experience," Thomas affirmed. "Emotional dependence and attachment to the past remain works in progress," Margaret admitted. "But there's movement there too. I'm practicing being my own good company, finding resources within myself rather than immediately reaching for external validation when I'm uncomfortable. And you're sitting here today as living proof that these aren't just philosophical concepts," Thomas said, "but practical pathways to the serenity that becomes possible in our later years." Margaret nodded, gratitude evident in her expression. "Thank you, Thomas, for sharing these insights, for your patience as I stumble through the practice." "The work has been yours," Thomas replied. "I merely pointed toward what was already possible within you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the autumn light play across the lake's surface. After a while, Thomas spoke again, his voice gentle yet clear. "These 8 burdens we've discussed, they're universal in many ways, yet deeply personal in how they manifest in each life. The need to explain yourself, the habit of overthinking, the reflex to compare, the obsession with busyness, the hunger for approval, the illusion of control, emotional dependence, attachment to the past. Each one seems innocent enough on its own," Margaret observed. "It's only in seeing the collective weight they create that we recognize how much they've been limiting our peace." "Precisely," Thomas nodded. And in your journey these past weeks, you've demonstrated what becomes possible when we begin to set them down one by one, with awareness and compassion. For ourselves, it isn't always easy, Margaret acknowledged. Old patterns reassert themselves, especially under stress. The path isn't linear, Thomas agreed. Release isn't a one-time event, but an ongoing practice. What matters is the growing ability to recognize these patterns when they arise, and to choose differently again and again, with patience for the process. Margaret glanced at her watch. Not from the habitual urgency that once drove her days, but from a gentle awareness of time as a gift to be honored. I should be going, she said. My granddaughter is coming for dinner tonight. Before you go, Thomas said, I have something for you. He carefully removed a page from his sketchbook and handed it to her. Margaret looked down at the drawing, a rendering of their bench by the lake, but with a quality of stillness and peace that transcended the mere physical scene. In the corner, in a careful hand, he had written, "Remember that serenity is not something you achieve. It is what remains when you stop drowning it out." "Thank you," she said simply, knowing the sketch would serve as a tangible reminder of all she was learning to release. As you reflect on Margaret's journey, perhaps you recognize aspects of your own experience in her story. The invisible burdens you've carried perhaps for decades that may be standing between you and the peace that is your birthright in these later years of life. What would it feel like to set down the exhausting need to explain yourself to others? To release the mental hamster wheel of overthinking that keeps you from restful sleep and present living? To free yourself from the reflex to compare your journey to others and instead honor the unique path that is authentically yours? Imagine the space that might open within you if you release the constant doing that our culture has taught you equals worth. If you no longer hungered for others' approval to validate your choices. If you discerned with wisdom and clarity what is truly yours to control and what is not. What relationships might deepen if emotional dependence no longer created unstable ground beneath them? What possibilities might emerge if attachment to the past no longer defined what you believe is possible today? This journey towards serenity isn't about adding more to your life, more disciplines, more achievements, more striving. It's about subtraction, about gentle, persistent release of what no longer serves you. About remembering who you are beneath the noise that has accumulated over decades of living in a demanding world. The Stoics understood this truth centuries ago, offering timeless wisdom that speaks directly to our modern challenges. Peace is not something to chase. It is something that remains when the chasing stops. As you move through your days, consider approaching these 8 burdens not as enemies to be conquered, but as old companions you've outgrown, familiar patterns that once may have served you, but now only limit the expansiveness of what your life can be. Release them not out of discipline, but out of compassion for yourself. Not through force, but through awareness. Not all at once, but one moment, one breath, one choice at a time. Be silent within yourself. Get rid of these 8 things that stand between you and serenity, not because you should, but because you deserve the peace that waits on the other side of letting go. The quiet transformation that Margaret experienced is available to you too, not as a distant goal to be achieved through striving, but as a natural state that emerges when you stop rehearsing the noise that has buried it. Your later years can be characterized not by diminishment, but by a deepening into what has always been most true and essential about you. The wisdom you've earned through decades of living becomes most powerful when it's no longer obscured by these unnecessary burdens. This is your invitation to remember who you are beneath the noise, to trade the weight of explaining, overthinking, comparing, and constant doing for the lightness that comes with authentic living. To release the hunger for approval, the illusion of control, emotional dependence, and attachment to the past that keep you bound to patterns that no longer serve you. The serenity you seek is not something distant or foreign to your nature. It is what remains when you finally let go. I hope you enjoyed this. Every day we share stories or lessons that speak to the heart. Subscribe and join us. Also, your experience matters, so please leave a comment to share your story or ask me a question. Thanks for watching.